Now, we need to understand what this hand-washing thing is all about. First of all, we need to know that they weren't upset because it wasn't a matter of hygiene. It wasn't that they were upset because they didn't use soap. And they weren't upset because they were breaking one of God's laws in not washing their hands. This ceremonial hand washing before a meal was a tradition that was developed by the Jewish religious leaders and handed down from one generation to the next. You see, over the centuries after God gave the law, over the centuries, the Jewish religious leaders took that law, that moral law, and tried to come up with every possible human situation where that law might be applied and say, here's what you do in this situation, here's what you do in this situation. On Sunday, what it means to work is that if you take more than 300 steps, you're working. So you can take up to 299, so count your steps on Sunday. Those kinds of things. This is what they did to make sure that no one broke the heart of the law. They codified the law. And they made it so difficult, and they, over the centuries, added thousands and thousands and thousands of man-made laws to the law of God to help us understand how to follow it, that no one could keep track of or follow all these laws except the religious leaders themselves. And the only reason they could do it was because it was their full-time job. That was all they had to do, was keep track of the law and make sure they followed it. The ordinary person couldn't do it. And this specific hand-washing ritual before eating came from God's law in Exodus chapter 30. In Exodus chapter 30, God tells the priests that they need to ceremonially wash their hands before they lead worship in the temple. This was the law of God. Then the religious leaders came along and said, that law is not going to just apply to the priests leading worship in the temple, but it's going to apply to all Jews who come to worship God in the temple. And not only when they're worshiping God in the temple, but before they eat even. Even before they eat, they need to ceremonially wash their hands before they eat. This issue of trying to be clean was very difficult to follow because being unclean was transferable. That means that if you, even though you were clean, touched something or someone that was unclean, then you became unclean. For some of you that are my age, when I was younger, like 3rd and 4th grade, we had a thing called cooties. Did you guys deal with cooties in school? Where somebody would have cooties, and if you touched them, then you had cooties. And then you had to touch someone else to get rid of the cooties, and you'd pass the cooties all around. And it was a matter of just touching to transfer this terrible disease. And that's the way the Jewish religious leaders were dealing with this clean and unclean. If you were clean and you touched a plate that was unclean, then you became unclean. And it got ridiculous because not only were all Gentiles unclean, so if you were in the marketplace and you bumped up against a non-Jew, you'd be unclean because you touched them, but even buildings were unclean. Certain buildings were unclean, and even if you stood under the overhang of a building that was unclean, you became unclean. You can see how complicated and difficult it was to stay clean, to be a devout Jew and stay clean, because if you were unclean, you couldn't worship God. You were defiled. You were unacceptable to God. And so a devout Jew had to be very careful about who they associated with, where they hung out. And as the text says in Matthew 7, a devout Jew who went to the marketplace would be sure to wash afterwards, because the marketplace was full of unclean people and unclean things, because they didn't want to be defiled. They didn't want to be unacceptable to God. Now, with these stipulations, you can see how difficult it was for a normal, average Jew trying to live life and trying to stay clean. You can see how difficult it was for them. Well, with all of this in mind, let's go back to the text now. We go back to verse 2, where Jesus' disciples were eating without ceremonially washing their hands. They'd been to the marketplace, gotten food, and now they were eating the food, but they didn't pour water over their hands. And the Pharisees saw this, and they were outraged. And in verse 5 of our passage, the Pharisees challenge Jesus here, and they say, why don't your disciples live according to the traditions of the elders instead of eating their food with unclean hands? That is, unwashed hands. Now, this challenge by the Pharisees, it makes Jesus furious. Many times Jesus would have civil discourse and civil dialogue with the Pharisees and teachers of the law, but he was angry here. And he rebuked them publicly and sternly for not only this question, but this teaching and this attitude. Because remember, the issue on the table here is not about washing hands. The issue on the table is the nature of human beings and how human beings relate to God and how we as human beings should relate to each other. Those are the issues that Jesus is dealing with here with this attitude. And that's why he gets so angry so quick. The Pharisees and the teachers of the law asked Jesus, why don't your disciples live according to the traditions of the elders? And Jesus responds initially in two ways. First, in verse 6, he responds by calling the Pharisees hypocrites. And secondly, in verse 8, he responds by calling what the Pharisees call the traditions of the elders. Jesus calls them the traditions of men. They're not God's laws. They're man's laws. Jesus makes it clear what we're dealing with here. You see, Jesus knew that the Pharisees were hypocrites. He knew they were pretenders. They said the right things with their mouths, but their hearts were far from God. By following all of the rules that they had made up, like the ceremonial hand washing, the Pharisees were pretending to be devout, pretending to love God and obey him. But if they really loved God, then they would have been in that unclean marketplace all day long, talking to the people who were lost, talking to them about God. But instead, they'd rather be pretenders and seclude themselves from those people that were unclean. And instead of spending their energy and their time and their knowledge of God telling these people who were lost how they could know God, they spent their time and their energy avoiding those people, staying away from them. Their hearts were not right before God. They didn't want to be contaminated and be unclean. In verse 6, Jesus says about the Pharisees, he says, they honor God with their lips, but their hearts are far from him. They worship him in vain, he says. You see, the Pharisees made sacrifices to God, and they did the ceremonies and washed their hands and did all the things to stay pure, but God was not impressed because their hearts were not right before God. The situation reminds me of a man that I read about this week, a man named Rob Smitty, who donated one of his kidneys to a stranger. True story. Rob Smitty donated one of his kidneys to a stranger, and it seems like a very noble and generous sacrifice. What happened was that while he was browsing the internet, Smitty developed an interest in people who needed organs. And he said that his motivation for doing this involved doing something that would make his children proud, giving someone else one of his kidneys. But his 10-year-old daughter said she wasn't impressed by the sacrifice. His daughter Amber said her father never comes to see her, never calls her, not even on her birthday. She said, I don't think he's much of a hero.